January 1945. A converted schoolhouse near the Rhine River stands half buried in snow. The war is close now, close enough to hear artillery breathing in the distance. Inside, the air smells of disinfectant, boiled water, and damp wool. Rows of metal beds line the corridor. On them lie wounded men in unfamiliar uniforms, some German, some not. The rules of the front dissolve here. Weapons are gone. Rank means little. Pain is equal. German nurses move quietly between the beds. Many are young. All were trained to expect cruelty from the enemy. They were told hatred would be returned with hatred. Then something happens that does not fit the war they were taught. An Allied soldier, thin from weeks of combat, breaks a piece of bread from his ration. He slides it across a tray. Another adds a cigarette. No words are exchanged. No gestures of triumph. Just food deliberately shared. The nurses stop. They watch. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is impossible. Outside, the war continues exactly as planned. Inside this room, something small and human has crossed the front line, and it will quietly follow them long after the guns move on, carrying them into a world shaped by how this moment became possible. By the time that winter arrived in 1945, German military nursing had already been stretched beyond recognition. At the start of the war, most German nurses serving near the front belonged to organizations tied directly or indirectly to the state. The German Red Cross, the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, or auxiliary nursing services attached to field hospitals. Their training emphasized discipline, efficiency, and emotional restraint. Compassion was permitted, but always within hierarchy. Neutrality existed on paper, yet ideology surrounded everything. From the first days of the conflict, nurses were taught what the enemy was supposed to be. Allied soldiers were described not merely as opponents, but as corrupting forces, brutal, morally decayed, driven by hatred of Germany itself. This framing was reinforced through lectures, pamphlets, and controlled newsreels. Even humanitarian workers were not immune to this worldview. The front was presented as a moral boundary, not just a physical one. Medical service near combat zones followed strict rules. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical personnel and facilities were to be protected, neutral, and respected by all sides. In practice, this protection was uneven. Hospitals were shelled. Evacuation routes were bombed. Nurses worked under constant threat, often without sufficient supplies, heat, or rest. By 1943, shortages had become severe. Allied bombing campaigns disrupted rail networks and supply depots. Food was rationed carefully, especially in forward medical units. Nurses frequently survived on the same thin soups and bread allotted to wounded soldiers. By late 1944, hunger was no longer theoretical. It was daily reality. On the Western Front, the situation differed from the East, but not by much. As Allied forces advanced through France, Belgium, and into Germany, field hospitals multiplied. Casualties surged. Medical units became fluid, shifting locations rapidly to avoid encirclement or destruction. In this chaos, German nurses increasingly encountered wounded enemy soldiers. Captured Allied troops were treated according to international law. They were to receive medical care equivalent to that given to German wounded. This principle was officially upheld, though resources often made equality impossible. Still, mixed wards became common. American, British, Canadian, and German soldiers recovering side by side, separated more by language than by bandages. For many nurses, this was their first sustained contact with the enemy outside propaganda. These men were not caricatures. They bled the same way. They cried out in pain the same way. They asked for water, not vengeance. Yet the nurses carried assumptions with them into these rooms. They expected bitterness. They expected mockery. They expected cruelty born from victory. What they did not expect was restraint. On the Allied side, medical doctrine emphasized discipline toward prisoners and wounded enemies. U.S. Army manuals instructed soldiers to treat POWs humanely, not simply for moral reasons, but for order and reciprocity. British medical units, drawing on longer traditions of imperial warfare and Red Cross coordination, reinforced similar standards. Food, however, was never abundant. Allied rations were carefully calculated. Soldiers were taught to guard them closely. Hunger was universal across all armies by late war. A single ration could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. This is what made later moments so striking to the nurses who witnessed them. Food was not symbolic. It was survival. To give it away was not casual kindness. It was a choice made against instinct. These nurses had been prepared for many things: blood, death, exhaustion, fear. They had not been prepared for deliberate generosity from men they were told would never offer it. And as the front lines crept closer to German soil and hospitals filled faster than they could be emptied, these quiet encounters became more frequent, setting the conditions for moments that would challenge everything they believed about the enemy standing on the other side of the war. By late 1944, the Allied advance had reached a scale that transformed the medical landscape of the war. The collapse of German defensive lines in France and the Low Countries produced not only prisoners in the tens of thousands, but wounded prisoners, men captured during firefights, bombardments, and chaotic retreats. Medical units on both sides were forced to adapt quickly. Allied armies carried their own wounded forward with speed and scale unmatched earlier in the war. Field hospitals followed close behind the front, often within range of artillery. As lines shifted, these facilities absorbed not only Allied casualties, but German wounded left behind during withdrawals. Medical neutrality, fragile but persistent, created spaces where enemies lay within arm's reach of one another. For German nurses, this proximity was unprecedented. Earlier in the war, enemy wounded were rare and distant. Now they were constant. American soldiers arrived with shrapnel wounds from artillery barges. British infantry were brought in after street fighting. Canadian troops came from forest battles and river crossings. Their injuries bore the same signatures as German ones: burns, fractures, blood loss, shock. Food distribution inside these hospitals followed rigid calculations. German supplies, already depleted, were allocated first to the most critical cases. POWs received rations consistent with international law, but these were often minimal. On the Allied side, supply lines were stronger, but not unlimited. Soldiers carried compact field rations designed to sustain combat, not generosity. And yet, inside these wards, the war's logic sometimes fractured. Allied soldiers were not required to share food. There was no regulation encouraging it. In fact, discipline manuals warned against unnecessary fraternization. The expectation was neutrality, not kindness. Care was to be given by medical staff, not by soldiers themselves. What the nurses witnessed, therefore, was not policy. It was individual choice. A cigarette slipped across a blanket, a piece of chocolate broken in half, a spoonful of powdered milk added to thin soup. These are not grand gestures. They were quiet, deliberate acts performed without ceremony, often without acknowledgement. Red Cross observers later noted such incidents in reports from Western Front medical facilities, though they were never emphasized. They did not alter outcomes. They did not change the war. But they were recorded because they contradicted expectations on both sides. 4 German nurses raised in a system that portrayed the enemy as irredeemably hostile. These moments carried disproportionate weight. They had been told the Allies would humiliate, starve, and mock the defeated. Instead, they saw restraint where power existed and generosity where scarcity ruled. The contrast became sharper when compared to other fronts. On the Eastern Front, medical conditions were far harsher. Starvation was widespread. Supplies collapsed entirely in many regions. Food sharing across enemy lines was nearly impossible, not for lack of humanity, but for lack of calories. Survival itself consumed every moral resource. This comparison mattered. Nurses who had served briefly in the East before being transferred west later described the difference as shocking. Not because the West was gentle, it was not, but because there was room, however small, for choice. By early 1945, As Allied forces crossed into German territory, these encounters increased. Hospitals inside Germany itself began treating enemy wounded regularly. The nurses were no longer distant observers of defeat. The war had entered their towns, their buildings, their daily lives. And it was here, in these familiar spaces turned into medical wards, that the meaning of food sharing changed again. What had once felt like an exception began to feel like a pattern, small, scattered, but persistent. The nurses did not romanticize it. They did not forget the bombings. They did not forgive the destruction. But they could no longer hold onto the image of an enemy incapable of restraint. That realization did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived slowly through repetition, through watching hands move across trays, through seeing hunger paused briefly by choice. And as these moments accumulated, they began to shape how the nurses understood not only the men in front of them, but the war itself, preparing the ground for deeper questions that would emerge when these encounters reached their quiet turning point. For the German nurses, the war had always been experienced at one remove. They did not fire rifles. They did not advance under cover of smoke. Their battlefield was measured in heartbeats, infection rates, and whether the next supply truck would arrive before nightfall. Yet their proximity to suffering gave them a perspective few soldiers possessed. They watched men stripped of insignia and certainty. Wounded soldiers did not perform hatred. Pain made everyone similar. The nurses learned quickly that ideology bled out faster than blood pressure. In this setting, the act of sharing food was not interpreted as mercy bestowed from strength, but as recognition of shared fragility. Many nurses later described the moment they realized no one was watching. No guards, no officers, just wounded men making decisions that would never appear in reports. That absence of spectacle mattered. It suggested sincerity. The nurses also understood the cost. Allied soldiers were not well-fed visitors. They were men who had marched, fought, and slept in cold fields for weeks. Their rations were calculated precisely to prevent collapse. Giving any portion away meant enduring hunger later, and doing so knowingly. This awareness shaped how the nurses interpreted what they saw. The gesture was not sentimental. It was practical kindness, grounded in an understanding of what deprivation actually meant. Tactical angle, neutral ground in a total war. Medical spaces in World War II occupied a strange tactical position. They were protected in theory and violated in practice. Yet when they functioned as intended, they created zones where the war paused without stopping. Field hospitals brought enemies into physical proximity without weapons. This alone altered behavior. Soldiers accustomed to seeing the enemy through gun sights now saw them through bandages. Food sharing occurred most often in these environments because they removed immediate threat. There was no advantage to dominance, no tactical gain. From a military standpoint, such behavior did not undermine discipline. It occurred after combat, not during it. Commanders rarely interfered unless it disrupted order. In many cases, they were unaware. This made the phenomenon structurally possible. The environment allowed humanity without inviting chaos. Enemy angle, Allied soldiers, and moral continuity. For Allied soldiers, especially those from the United States and Britain, humanitarian conduct toward wounded enemies was not entirely spontaneous. It rested on training, tradition, and cultural framing. They were repeatedly told that how they treated prisoners reflected the society they represented. This framing did not erase anger or grief. Many of the men sharing food had lost friends days earlier. Some had seen civilians killed. The decision to share was not forgiveness. It was compartmentalization. Food sharing became a way to assert control over one's own behavior when everything else felt dictated by violence. It allowed soldiers to draw a boundary between combat and cruelty. For the nurses observing this, the distinction mattered deeply. It suggested that hatred was not inevitable, even after months of bloodshed. These three angles intersected quietly, without announcement. Human vulnerability, tactical neutrality, and moral continuity overlapped in moments small enough to be ignored, but strong enough to endure. And as these perspectives converged, they created conditions for a shift that went beyond individual gestures, one that would surface more clearly when these acts accumulated into a turning point no one planned, but many remembered. By the final year of the war, morality was no longer abstract. It was measured in calories, minutes of sleep, and the ability to keep working through exhaustion. For German nurses, morality had been framed by duty and obedience. Compassion existed, but it was not supposed to cross lines. What they witnessed in these hospitals complicated that framework. Food was the last private possession left to a soldier. Weapons could be taken, orders could be ignored, but rations were personal. To give food away, especially to an enemy, was a choice made without external pressure. It did not serve ideology. It did not advance victory. That is why it registered so deeply. Nurses understood scarcity intimately. They counted supplies daily. They stretched portions. They watched wounded men weaken when deliveries were delayed. Seeing Allied soldiers reduce their own margins of survival contradicted the logic of total war, which taught that the enemy's weakness was one's advantage. This moral contradiction forced reevaluation. If the enemy could choose restraint when power allowed cruelty, then hatred was not inevitable. It was conditional. Psychological angle. The collapse of propaganda. Propaganda works best at a distance. It requires abstraction. Enemies become symbols, not people. The hospital destroyed that distance completely. German nurses have been surrounded by imagery depicting the enemy as brutal, mocking, incapable of empathy. These images had gone largely unchallenged until reality arrived on stretchers. The nurses did not undergo ideological conversions. They did not reject their country or its suffering, but something eroded. Certainty cracked. Repeated exposure to small contradictions weakens belief systems more effectively than confrontation. Each shared cigarette, each broken piece of bread, acted as evidence that did not fit the narrative they had been taught. Psychologically, this mattered because nurses occupied a liminal role. They were not decision-makers. They were witnesses. Their memories would outlast orders. Leadership and doctrine angle. What was allowed to happen? It is important to note what did not occur. Allied command did not promote food sharing. German command did not formally prohibit it. The phenomenon existed in a space of permissive neglect. Medical doctrine emphasized neutrality. As long as order was maintained, behavior inside wards was rarely scrutinized. This lack of interference created room for personal ethics to surface. Leadership mattered precisely because it did not intervene. By enforcing humanitarian norms without micromanaging behavior, commanders unintentionally allowed moments of grace to occur. For the nurses, this revealed something unexpected. Even in a system designed for destruction, there were pockets where humanity was not punished. These moral, psychological, and doctrinal angles converged slowly, reinforcing one another. The nurses did not speak openly about what they saw. There was no language for it. But the accumulation of these moments prepared them for something more defined, a turning point where these gestures could no longer be dismissed as anomalies. That turning point would not arrive with fanfare. It would come during routine operations, in familiar rooms, when repetition transformed surprise into recognition. The turning point did not arrive on a battlefield. It arrived in routine. By February 1945, medical facilities across Western Germany were overwhelmed. As Allied forces pushed beyond the Rhine, hospitals that had once served only German soldiers now treated enemy wounded daily. Schools, monasteries, rail depots, and municipal buildings were converted into wards. There was no time to separate stories by uniform. In several documented Red Cross medical stations along the Lower Rhine and in the Ruhr corridor, German nurses began to notice a pattern. The first incident of food sharing had been dismissed as individual character. The second as coincidence. By the fifth or sixth, coincidence no longer held. One report from a Red Cross-supervised hospital near Basel noted that American wounded arriving by evacuation train often retained small portions of their rations even after intake. These are not confiscated. Regulations did not require it. What followed surprised the staff. Within days, nurses observed these items being redistributed. Not hoarded, not hidden, but passed quietly to others, including German wounded whose portions had been reduced by shortages. The nurses did not intervene. They watched. The significance was not in the quantity. A biscuit, a few spoonfuls of powdered soup, sometimes nothing more than a cigarette or sugar cube. What mattered was repetition. The acts were deliberate and unprompted. They occurred even when no nurse was present, discovered only when trays were cleared or wrappers found where they should not have been. In one field hospital operating from a converted convent outside Cologne, British soldiers recovering from mortar wounds were treated in the same ward as German Volksgrenadiers evacuated from the front. According to post-war nursing testimonies collected in regional archives, food exchanges occurred across beds without acknowledgement. No thanks, no conversation, only the movement of hands. This absence of language mattered. It stripped the act of performance. There was no attempt to reframe the enemy as friend. The war was not denied. The sharing existed alongside hostility, not in place of it. For the nurses, this coexistence was destabilizing. They had been taught that mercy followed victory, that generosity came after surrender. But here, generosity existed without resolution. The enemy had not laid down arms. The war was still killing thousands every week. And yet, restraint appeared anyway. One nurse later wrote that this was the moment she realized the war was no longer explaining itself. The categories she relied on, enemy, ally, victor, defeated, no longer predicted behavior. Hunger did not always produce selfishness. Power did not always produce cruelty. The climax was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no realization spoken aloud. It was the accumulation of ordinary actions that forced a shift in understanding. By March 1945, these patterns had become visible enough that some nurses adjusted their expectations unconsciously. They no longer waited for hostility from Allied wounded. They no longer braced for humiliation. Instead, they prepared for neutrality and occasionally for quiet decency. This psychological shift did not alter their work. Bandages were still changed, wounds still cleaned, death still arrived without warning. But the emotional framework surrounding these tasks had changed. The nurses were no longer simply treating bodies. They were observing choices. And it was within this altered awareness, born not from ideology, but from repeated evidence, that the war crossed a threshold inside these medical spaces, setting the stage for a second phase of this turning point, when these moments would no longer feel isolated, but emblematic of something larger unfolding as the conflict neared its end. As the spring of 1945 approached, the war compressed time. Advances accelerated. Retreats collapsed. Medical facilities became holding spaces where the future waited to arrive. It was during this period that the meaning of food sharing shifted again from pattern to signal. In hospitals closer to the advancing front, Allied wounded often arrived in waves following rapid offensives. Some were treated briefly before being moved west. Others remained for weeks. German nurses observed that the longer Allied soldiers stayed, the more consistent the behavior became. Rations were no longer treated as private reserves. They became communal resources within the ward. This was not collectivism. It was situational adaptation. Soldiers adjusted to the reality in front of them. Wounded men, limited food, and no immediate danger. Sharing stabilized the environment. It reduced tension. It created predictability. Nurses noticed the effect on German wounded as well. Men who had arrived withdrawn and hostile often softened after receiving food from an enemy hand. Not gratitude, but recalibration. The expectation of cruelty was unmet. The emotional energy required to sustain hatred dissipated. Red Cross observers later described a decline in ward conflicts in mixed hospitals during this period. While many factors contributed, exhaustion, proximity to defeat, medical sedation, the presence of small, stabilizing behaviors mattered. Food sharing was one of them. This was the moment when the nurses' understanding crossed a threshold. These actions were no longer interpreted as exceptions born of unusual personalities. They were recognized as responses to circumstance, proof that behavior could change even without ideological shifts. In one documented case from a hospital in the Harz region, nurses reported that Allied soldiers occasionally requested that surplus rations be redistributed by staff to those most weakened. This mattered because it transferred agency. The gesture was no longer private. It acknowledged the nurses as participants rather than witnesses. The nurses did not romanticize this. They were aware that the same soldiers had fought fiercely days earlier. Some had likely killed Germans in battle. The sharing did not erase that reality, but it introduced complexity into moral categories that had previously felt absolute. As Germany's defeat became undeniable, these encounters took on added weight. The future relationship between victors and defeated was beginning, not in courtrooms or treaties, but in hospital wards. The climax, then, was not a single event. It was the realization that the war's final lesson was being delivered quietly, not through punishment, but through behavior observed under stress. When Allied forces formally took control of many of these facilities in April 1945, the pattern did not end. In some places, it expanded. Food supplies improved. Redistribution became formalized. But the nurses remember the earlier phase most vividly, when sharing had been voluntary and costly. That distinction mattered. It separated humanitarian obligation from moral choice. By the time surrender arrived, many nurses carried a revised understanding of the enemy with them. Not a softened memory of the war. The destruction was too great for that, but a more complicated one. They had learned that even inside a total war, where hatred was cultivated deliberately, individuals retained the capacity to act differently. Not heroically, not symbolically, just deliberately. And as the guns fell silent, these memories did not disappear with relief. They moved forward into the aftermath, shaping how the war would be remembered, interpreted, and quietly retold by those whose role had been to watch rather than decide. When a war in Europe ended in May 1945, the medical wards did not empty immediately. Wounds outlasted surrender. Infections continued. Malnutrition lingered. German nurses remained at their posts under Allied supervision, now working inside a defeated nation whose structures had collapsed almost overnight. In the immediate aftermath, Allied military governments conducted assessments of medical facilities they inherited. Red Cross representatives compiled reports on hospital conditions, POW treatment, and civilian care. These documents focused on infrastructure, mortality rates, and supply chains. Human behavior inside wards appeared only in margins. Yet within those margins, the nurses' experiences persisted. Many German nurses were interrogated or debriefed as part of denazification processes. Their role as medical personnel placed them in a complex category, essential, yet politically suspect. Some were dismissed, others retained temporarily. A few continued nursing under new administrations. In these early months, survival took precedence over reflection. Food shortages worsened before they improved. Cities lay in ruins. Hospitals functioned with minimal equipment. The generosity witnessed during the war did not translate into abundance afterward, but memory remained. Nurses began to speak quietly among themselves about what they had seen, not in public forums, not in official testimony. These conversations were private, cautious, and fragmentary. There was no incentive to emphasize moments of kindness from former enemies. Such stories complicated narratives of suffering that dominated post-war discourse. Nevertheless, some accounts entered written records indirectly. Nursing diaries, regional memoirs, and Red Cross correspondence preserve references to unexpected restraint and cooperation. These were not framed as reconciliation. They were observations. Allied records, too, acknowledged the behavior obliquely. Post-war evaluations of POW treatment noted that conditions in mixed hospitals were generally stable, with fewer incidents than anticipated. The reasons were not analyzed in depth. The war had produced too much data for subtlety. For the nurses, The aftermath was shaped by contrast. The men who had shared food often vanished westward. They were discharged, repatriated, or redeployed. There were no farewells, no exchange of names. The encounters remained unresolved. This lack of closure mattered. It prevented mythologizing. The memories stayed grounded, incomplete, resistant to simplification. As Germany entered occupation, humanitarian law became visible in new ways. Geneva Convention principles were no longer abstract. They had been lived. Nurses recognized their value not as ideology, but as structure, frameworks that allowed decency to survive under pressure. The nurse's professional identity also shifted. Many had entered service believing they were instruments of a system. They emerged understanding they were witnesses to individual choice. This distinction altered how they understood responsibility. The aftermath did not elevate these moments into symbols. There were no monuments, no official recognition. But for the nurses who experienced them, the war's end did not erase the memory of bread broken without instruction or cigarettes offered without expectation. Those memories persisted quietly, waiting to surface when the immediate tasks of survival gave way to longer reflection, setting the stage for how these experiences would be understood not just as wartime anomalies, but as part of the war's human residue. As the years passed, the war began to harden into narrative. Battles were analyzed. Leaders were judged. Atrocities were documented. In this process, experiences that resisted clear moral framing often faded from view. For German nurses, the memory of enemy soldiers sharing food did not fit easily into post-war categories. It did not absolve guilt. It did not undo destruction. And it did not align neatly with national suffering or Allied victory. It remained something quieter, personal, unresolved. In post-war interviews conducted decades later by regional historical institutes in West Germany, several former nurses described moments of unexpected restraint in medical wards. They spoke carefully, often emphasizing that such behavior did not excuse the war itself. What they remembered was not kindness as redemption, but kindness as contradiction. These accounts emerged slowly, often prompted by questions about medical ethics rather than reconciliation. The nurses framed their experiences in professional terms. They spoke of standards upheld under pressure, of behavior observed when no authority demanded it. In some cases, these memories influenced careers. A number of former nurses became involved in post-war humanitarian organizations, civilian hospitals, or Red Cross work. Their motivation was rarely articulated as ideological change. Instead, they described a reinforced belief that systems matter, that rules protecting the vulnerable create space for moral choice. Allied veterans, when interviewed separately, rarely mentioned these moments. For many, the acts were unremarkable. Sharing food in a hospital did not register as extraordinary compared to the scale of the war. This asymmetry of memory mattered. What was ordinary to one side was transformative to the other. The contrast reveals something essential about power and perception. Those with advantage rarely remember restraint as history. Those without it do. By the late 20th century, historians began paying closer attention to medical neutrality and humanitarian conduct during World War II. Studies of POW treatment, Red Cross operations, and field hospitals surface fragments of the nurses' experiences. Still, these stories remain peripheral, footnotes to a war defined by violence. Yet their persistence in archival margins is significant. They demonstrate that even in a conflict engineered for total mobilization and ideological purity, behavior could escape design, not through rebellion, but through discretion. For the nurses, these memories aged differently from others. Trauma dulled with time. Shock softened. But the memory of unexpected decency retained clarity. It remained useful, not as comfort, but as evidence. Evidence that the enemy had not always behaved as predicted. Evidence that systems built for destruction still contained spaces where individual ethics operated. This realization did not erase bitterness or grief. Many nurses lost family members. Many worked through air raids and mass casualties. Their understanding of the war remained severe, but was also precise. They knew that the war's moral landscape had not been uniform, that even within catastrophe, behavior varied, that food shared across enemy lines did not change outcomes, but it altered memory. As these women aged, fewer spoke publicly. Their stories passed into private recollection, regional archives, and unindexed transcripts. They did not seek attention. They did not seek validation. What they carried forward was not reconciliation, but complexity. And it was this complexity, fragile, unspectacular, and resistant to slogans, that would ultimately shape how the war's human meaning could be understood beyond victory and defeat, preparing the ground for reflection on what such moments reveal about conflict itself. The Second World War is remembered for its scale, its machinery, and its brutality. It is measured in casualties, cities erased, and systems exposed. Yet beneath those measurements lies another layer of history, one that does not change outcomes, but changes understanding. What the German nurses witnessed did not stop the war. It did not lessen the crimes committed or the suffering endured. It did not soften defeat or redeem victory. Its meaning lies elsewhere. It lies in the fact that even in a conflict designed to strip individuals of choice survived. Food, in the final year of the war, was not symbolic. It was life reduced to calculation. To share it without instruction, without reward, and without audience was an act stripped of narrative. It carried no message. It sought no forgiveness. It simply acknowledged another human being at a moment when systems demanded indifference. For the nurses, this mattered because they were trained to observe, not to interpret. They were present where ideology met reality, where propaganda collapsed under repetition. They learned that hatred required maintenance, and that when pressure disrupted that maintenance, something else could emerge. These moments do not rewrite history. They refine it. They remind us that wars are not experienced uniformly, that within the same conflict, cruelty and restraint can coexist without canceling each other. That moral behavior does not always announce itself as resistance. Sometimes it appears as routine decency in places designed only for survival. The shared bread in a hospital ward did not symbolize peace. It symbolized continuity, the persistence of human judgment under conditions meant to erase it. When the war ended, treaties were signed, borders redrawn, and verdicts delivered. But the nurses carried a quieter conclusion with them, that even inside total war, humanity was not entirely extinguished. It was reduced, constrained, and overshadowed, but not eliminated. And that realization, born not from ideology, but from observation, remains one of the war's most uncomfortable truths, because it suggests that the capacity for restraint does not vanish in war. It waits, silently, for the moment when someone chooses to act differently, even when nothing requires them to.